Hello, I'm Zach, and today we're going to talk about the top 3 business models for freelancers to target when starting out. So I wanted to do a quick disclaimer before we get into the business models that the right choice is very subjective and it's going to depend on your own goals and values. So if you're watching this from within my transitioning from a dev job to freelance course, be sure to go into the vision section and do all of the goal setting exercises to make sure that you're making choices that are going to make sense for the long term. If you're not in that course yet, it's totally free to join. Just go to quityourdevjob.com and you can join and follow along, download the bonuses, and that sort of thing. So the 3 business models, these are not the only 3 that are available. They're not even necessarily my top picks. However, they are the most relevant when you're getting started. I'm going to have a follow-up video to this that talks about some hybrid business models that I think are really nice long-term options, but the 3 we're going to talk about today are really ideal for options to set your sights on when you're first starting. Whereas those hybrid business models kind of don't really make sense till you've been doing it for 5+ years most of the time. So the 3 business models we're going to cover are a bespoke-style top-tier freelancer with maximum freedom, a bespoke-style large agency, and a productized business. So I'm going to explore the pros and cons of each. So first up, the bespoke-style freelancer, top-tier freelancer with maximum freedom, aka me. So what this looks like for me, the business that I've built, and I should say I didn't go into this with much intentionality at all. I've been doing this for like 13 years, I think, and I have tried all sorts of different things, and I didn't really invest a lot of good time in advance to planning or thinking what made sense for my values, but at the same time, my values have changed a lot over the years. So all that being said, I've tried to do actually all the business models in this video at different times in my business. This is the one that I landed on because this is what makes the most sense for me. So a week in the life of Zach looks like about 12 hours of client work right now. At this point, I've turned away all projects except one that gives me ongoing work. So at this point, I work about 12 hours a week on client work and then spend the rest of my time either on these videos or on music production or on some software product or something like that. The advantages of this approach are that your life is simple. You don't really have to become good at a bunch of different skills necessarily. You don't have to even become that good at marketing if you're targeting a modest income. Like I target usually 60 to 80 grand a year US dollars, which to me, it's good income. I can buy all the things I want. I can travel around. It's great. But if you're used to like good developer US income over the 100K mark, you'll obviously, if you're going this top tier freelancer route, you will just have to work more. Some other advantages here are good money per hour. So I have my rates set quite high so that I'm only working with clients with a large budget. You get the flexibility to do that if you're not necessarily working with a bunch of clients, because you can use your hourly rate as like a supply and demand lever to affect how much demand there is. You can lower demand by raising your rates, and that's kind of a nice thing. Opportunity for lots of freedom. You can work whenever you want. If you're not working with too many clients, you can batch those and travel around, enjoy whatever city you're in, go skiing on a Wednesday, whatever. And you don't have to manage people, as I said. So those are some of the advantages, but there are, of course, disadvantages. The biggest disadvantage, I would say, is that you don't really run like a business, at least not what I would define as like a business with a capital B. You kind of more just own your job. And if you don't work, you don't get paid. Savvy freelancers will build in things that have the opportunity to pay them over time. A lot of people will do things like having a monthly maintenance kind of service. I used to do that, but I didn't really enjoy the experience because, I don't know, it just didn't pay that well, and it's an obligation, and it's not really passive income because people are going to come in and want you to do a bunch of stuff. But yeah, so really, like, for the most part, unless you're super clever, more clever than me, if you don't work, you won't get paid. And there's also a somewhat low income cap depending on what you're aiming for. If you're wanting to have a Ferrari and live in a super cool mansion or whatever, it might be difficult as a freelance developer to do that because your income, it's probably going to be hard to get beyond the $200,000 or $300,000 a year mark. And then the other kind of disadvantage is if you're wanting to have a big impact on the world, you're a bit limited if it's only you. You only have so many hours in the day and week and month. And so you can't really marshal a bunch of resources. You can just kind of marshal your own time. Of course, if you build relationships with other freelancers with similar vision, you can partner on things, but you can't just launch some gigantic, ambitious project and have it done in a reasonable amount of time. It requires a lot of time investment. So the next business model we're going to talk about is the large bespoke style agency. The example of this is just any old big WordPress agency or big marketing agency where there are like designers and developers just building sites for companies, but a lot of them. The advantages of running a bespoke style agency are that you have a higher income cap than you would as a freelancer because you can do bigger and more expensive projects. And once you're at scale, you don't need to personally work so much to make money. In my journey to get where I am now, I at one point worked at a marketing agency, and it was actually the best decision I made for my business, which I will have in a different video in the course. But the owner of that agency had started it like 40 years prior. And when I was working there, he didn't really have to do anything. He still came into the office. I don't really know why. I don't know what he did, but he didn't have to be there. And that's a kind of nice thing once you have your agency at scale. You're also in more of a position to make a larger impact on the world because you have this big team. If you've got a team of 40 people with skills all across the board, you can just kind of decide that something is important to you and move the whole team towards that, and you can get some big stuff done. That's pretty cool. Cons, you have slimmer margins than a product-based business. And the example I often think of, I have done a lot of sites for podcasters. And the reason why is that I did a site for this one really big podcaster called Entrepreneur on Fire. And they used to publish their income reports and stuff. And when I was working with them, their actual yearly income was about $1.5 million US. When I worked at a marketing agency, their income was about $1.5 million US. Yeah. But Entrepreneur on Fire was just the two business owners and two virtual assistants to get that income. Whereas the marketing agency was like 40 people. So to me, I like the idea of having something more scalable versus something that requires such a gigantic team of humans just to make it work. So having to manage a lot of people, to me, that's a con. If you like working with a team, it might be a pro to you. Another thing that I consider a con is that you have to be able to produce enough clients to like pay the bills. If you have employees and you have an office, it means that you burn cash every month if you don't have clients coming through the door. So you have to have something in place that is reliably producing consistent clients for you. And to me, I think of large bespoke agencies as a bit more volatile and prone to expensive failure because of that high monthly expense thing. There are plenty of times in my freelance business that I probably should have failed when I was first starting out, but I didn't because my income bar was just so low that I could afford to really not have much work and not go under. But when I think about growing like an agency, that whole statistic of 90% of businesses failing within the first 3 years starts to make a lot more sense. And then another thing I consider a downside is that most people you employ won't really be entrepreneurs. They won't have that entrepreneur mindset. One of the big lessons that I'm teaching in this transitioning from your dev job to freelance course is adopting this entrepreneur mindset, because it's I think the hardest thing of going from being an unemployed developer to being a freelancer, but it's also the most important. And if you're running a large agency, most people won't have this entrepreneurial spirit, and they're going to want to just kind of do their one job, and they'll be in this very employee-oriented mindset, and it just means that you need more individual humans to get stuff done. But with, of course, some disclaimers, like if you make it clear to people you're running a startup and everyone has to wear a lot of hats, that'll help. And if you're hiring contractors, that'll also help. But if you're working with contractors, you tend to be paying more per hour for their work. So some side notes I have down, a consistent stream of clients for an agency could be something like thought leadership on a blog or paid ads. I've even seen things like having a relationship with a large company and kind of piggybacking their clients. So for example, a really big agency near where I used to live, they did exclusively big commerce websites. I don't even know if big commerce is still around, but they were basically a Shopify competitor. And this agency employed like 30 people. And if you went to the bigcommerce.com website and went to like agency partners, these guys were at the top of the list. So they just got all their business from them. But of course, the obvious downside is what happens if that relationship dries up? Business dies instantly. And that's kind of, to me, a little bit scary. So another side note is that if you do go this agency route, I recommend avoiding office expenses and employee expenses for as long as possible, as much as you can. There's a cool book. I have the link below the video called Secrets to a Successful Startup by Trevor G. Blake. The guy who wrote it has grown and sold like a couple of pharmaceutical companies for like $100 million. And he never had an employee, or maybe he had only one employee or something like that. So he grew these really large businesses only with a team of contractors, which is a compelling hook. So if that sounds interesting to you, be sure to check it out. And another side note is that if you're trying to run a large agency, in my opinion, it's still really beneficial to niche down, depending on the size. Like if you're trying to, I don't know, run a $100 million a year agency, obviously you have to be pretty broad. But if you're targeting like running an agency with like 40, 50 people, earning a couple $1,000,000 a year, you will benefit from having some sort of niche still. Like the example I gave of that agency that was doing the e-commerce sites. That's still kind of a niche down thing. Personally, I like the next business model we're going to talk about a bit better than the bespoke agency model. So yeah, let's dive into that. But a quick side note before we do, again, as I mentioned earlier, this video is a part of my How to Transition from Your Dev to Freelance Job course. If you're not in there already, it's totally free. And in it, you'll get basically a step-by-step process where I'll guide you through building more freedom and autonomy into your current job, getting your first freelance clients booked, building the dream business that makes sense for your goals, as I mentioned earlier, and a bunch of bonus checklists and worksheets and that sort of thing. So it's a very implementation-oriented course that's meant to just kind of be your foundation as you make this transition. And you can join it for free at quityourdevjob.com. So let's dive in and look at the final business model. So the final business model is the productized business. The reason I like it is it's a hybrid between a product-based business and a service-oriented business. At this stage in my career, I'm trying to build a product-based business. I really like the inherent scalability that you get. But the downside of product-based businesses is that you have to have a product, and that requires a large investment of money and or time. The nice thing about a service-oriented business is if you want to go out today and get your first freelance client, you just can. Like, yes, there will probably be logistics where you have to find the time and make sure your job is cool with it or whatever, but you could just go out and do it. Whereas if you wanted a product-based business, you'd have to invest a bunch of time into building a product. I've had many products I've tried to launch over these past few years that have been software products, and I've invested like often 6 to 8 months building the MVP of something that flopped, and that's a large investment. This productized business, it's a nice middle ground because you can get some of that scalability from that product aspect, but you also get the ease of launch and like easy dollars per hour of the service aspect. So the best example I can think of off the top of my head of a productized business would be, suppose you make websites for like pizza parlors. A pizzeria owner could come to your site. They could look at some of the different like basic templates that you offer. They could pick one and then they would buy it, and your designer in-house would like customize it for their colors and logos. And maybe you'd have a logo design add-on service or whatever. And You'd maybe still do some writing for them. Like you'd still do a service for them. It wouldn't just be the equivalent of Wix or whatever. But it also wouldn't be this like really bespoke work of art. And it's nice for the client because if this is their first website or their business isn't very profitable yet, usually productized businesses have a lower upfront cost. Not everyone wants to spend 5 to 10 grand on their first website. Oftentimes, as a business owner, you could have a productized business like this pizza shop thing, where you might have like a $500 or $1,000 setup fee and then charge $100 a month or something like that, or even less, whatever you decide to do. But you get this kind of like lean model that allows you to use your team resources more like selectively. Like the designer for this productized pizzeria site, they're only having to get the site to look good and match these colors and this logo versus designing the whole site from scratch, that sort of thing. So the advantages are that it's, in my opinion, easier to scale a business like this than a bespoke agency because it's more predictable. You can have documented processes and stuff that your team can follow, whereas the bespoke agency, at least in my experience, it's very reliant on humans and humans who are really good at their jobs. And I've always struggled with the management of humans. So being able to have something a little bit more streamlined is appealing to me. Easier to create processes for, as I said, and it also allows for lower paid staff than a bespoke agency because the tasks that would go into making that pizzeria website, for example, are not quite as complex as like needing a custom WordPress theme developed from scratch each time. And it also offers you a higher income cap in freelancing because it's this very naturally scalable business. Some of the cons are that it's less of a special product. Like it's the kind of thing you don't feel quite as proud of yourself signing your name under. You're not like, oh, I made this piece of art. If that's important to you, you might not like running a productized business. But I would still argue that it's not any less valuable running a productized business than a bespoke agency. And in many ways, it's more valuable. If you're running this bespoke agency and you're working with HP, like you're not really making a really big difference in this business. Whereas if you're running a productized business that's helping bootstrapping businesses like scrap together their first website and get their dreams off the ground, that's pretty cool. Another con is that it still requires human labor. So I think of it as slimmer margins than products. But you get that speed of launch and you have less like product development. So it mitigates your product development risk, which is nice. And another con is you still need a good stream of clients. If you're a freelancer who's just trying to make 60 grand a year, you don't need that many clients. If you're a productized business needing to pay all of your team and make it worthwhile for you to try to scale this thing, and you're charging less, most of all, you need more. Like let's say you want to make 60 grand a year as a productized business and you're charging a $1,000 setup fee and charging $100 a month. It's too complicated of math for me to do in my head, but you need like more clients than a freelancer. That's the takeaway here. A couple of side notes for the productized business. As I said at the beginning, it's more of a middle ground between an agency and a product, this model. And in this case, just like the agency, I think it's really good to have a niche still. And I would argue that with a productized business, it's even more important than the large bespoke agency to have a niche, because if you're going that pizza parlor route that I mentioned before, like your templates are going to be really relevant between your clients. And a lot of my freelance clients, for example, are financial advisors. And there are certain things I've learned by working with a bunch of financial advisors that everyone needs. Like everyone needs this disclosure, what is it even called? I can't remember now, but there's a specific disclosure that every financial advisor website has. And like, there are just certain things like that. When you work within a niche, there are common concerns that all of your customers will have and common needs that all the sites will have. You benefit by being in a niche. And it, of course, is beneficial from a marketing perspective because you as a company feel more relevant to them. Just like if you saw this video and it was called the top 3 business models for freelancers, it would feel less relevant to you than if it were called the top 3 business models for developers. So niching down is always going to be beneficial across all these different business models. So a couple things that I want to reiterate here or just touch on. All of these will thrive under thought leadership and a good traffic source, as well as a well-honed like funnel and email list lead conversion sort of system. This is something big that I have just missed and dropped the ball with my own freelancing business. I launched like a lead magnet on my site a while back, but never really promoted it. I don't even know how long it lived on the site because it hasn't been there for several years. I've never grown an email list. I don't have any good systems for like following up with past clients. I do a lot of things wrong in my freelancing business in the kind of like marketing, client retention, repeat business department. But what I do right is I do a really freaking good job on the websites that I build. And so I've gotten away with it. I've gotten away with kind of letting a bunch of marketing things slide because, as I said, I'm targeting 60 to 80 grand a year. That's just a handful of projects. I've been doing this for so long that people just randomly give me website referrals, and that has been fine. But if you're trying to grow it intelligently, know that all of these having like some thought leadership where people see you as an expert on a subject and they seek you out, that's always going to be beneficial. And it gives you a bit more control over your marketing. So that's just a little side note to keep in mind. So the next steps here are to think about what makes sense for you as next step number one. Watch the next video in the course that I'll be creating on the hybrid freelance models, which I like even better than these. But as I said, they're more of like a long-term kind of trajectory. And then join the free quityourdevjob.com course if you haven't already. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.